To listen to the conventional historian tell the story of the American Revolution, you would think that it was a war fought and won entirely in New England. But there is a reason why Lord Cornwallis surrendered his sword at Yorktown. Because just as much of the war was fought and won in the South as was won and fought in the North. In this 33rd broadcast of TBR Radio's TBR History Hour, Walter Edgar, Professor Emeritus of History, University of South Carolina, shares the role that the South played in the American Revolution.
American history, especially the story of the American Revolution, has often been neglected in textbooks published in classrooms for almost half a century. If you asked most Americans to discuss the Revolution, they would start with Lexington and Concord, fair enough, then go to Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and Yorktown, the end. Now, in general American histories, and especially in textbooks, 20th and 21st century historians, for the most part, consider the war in the South to be a sideshow. But somehow it all ended up at Yorktown. The revolution about which they write is not an American revolution. Instead, it is primarily a New England revolution with just a small passing nod to the Middle Atlantic colonies. Now, I know there are excellent monographs and studies of the war in the South, but it's from most general histories and texts that Americans, and particularly school children, get their history. I've spent the last decade or so sampling textbooks which two generations of students have used, and it's not an encouraging scene, either from a regional or a national level. One American history text, published in the last century, late, devoted only 5 pages to the American Revolution, 3 to social and political issues, and just 2 to the war itself. A more recent text, published at the turn of this century, of 976 pages, had just 4 to the war itself, a sequence that is introduced by the sentence, "The course of the war is soon told." What an understatement. The same author dismissed the battles of Kings Mountains, Cowpens, and Guilford Courthouse as being neither decisive nor particularly important. Now, there are other examples, but generally in textbooks, it's 2-to-1, Northern campaign, the war in the North, the independence movement in the North, as opposed to what is in the South. Now, the Southern campaign was crucial to what happened in the American Revolution. There's a reason why Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. The war just didn't jump from Saratoga to Yorktown. Now, in the American South, there had been considerable, in the southern colonies, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, had been revolutionary activity in battles in 1775 and 1776. But between 76 and 78, there wasn't much military action in the South. Most of it was in the Middle Atlantic and the North. But because of English politics, all of that was going to be changed. First of all, there was growing opposition to the war in England. Lord North, the Prime Minister, his government needed a big victory. And he thought that victory could be had in the South. Now, why all of a sudden, after spending 2 years chasing General Washington up north, do you decide that the South is going to be the primary focus of the British war effort? First of all, King George III was convinced that there were lots of loyalists in the South. In fact, he is quoted on several occasions as saying, "North Carolina is his most loyal colony." All they needed, he kept telling Lord North, is for the British government to send troops and ships, and then thousands would come out of the woodwork or out of the woods and openly show their support for the king. The southern coastline made it very easy to use the Royal Navy in support of military operations, and that's something you need to consider. You could move troops, you could also bring in battleships in the case of harbors like Charleston for basically artillery support. And also, something that is totally neglected, but I think crucially important, is that the southern colonies were the most important in North America economically in terms of trade with the mother country. By 1770, the value of just South Carolina's exports alone to England were 29% of the value of trade in the empire. one of the smallest colonies, had almost 30% of the value of exports. You throw in Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, and it gets probably close to half, if not more than half, of the value of exports. And the three wealthiest areas in North America in the 13 original colonies were all located in the South, in South Carolina, Maryland, and Virginia. English generals over here bought into the plan, Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis, and they did come up with a plan. They called it the Grand Campaign, the Great Campaign, the Southern Campaign. It's got several names in their correspondence. But they did have a plan, and the plan was first to take Savannah in Georgia, and then one by one they would roll up the southern colonies, and once they've got to Virginia, the revolution would, they had what they wanted, they'd declare the war over, and that would be that. Take Savannah, then the interior of the colony, and quite frankly, Georgia was very lightly populated, so beyond Savannah, there was a place, a little town of Ebenezer, and then you've got Augusta, but there's not a large population. Subdue that, restore royal government. That was a key part of it. You put the locals back in charge, more or less. And after Georgia was back in the empire, then the army would roll northward, and the loyalists in the Carolinas and Virginia would appear. And in more than one piece of correspondence, the king, Lord North, and the generals all believed the war would be over. So now we move to Savannah, Georgia in 1778. The plan began brilliantly for the British, greatly outnumbering the small American army in Georgia. They overwhelmed it completely, and what little opposition to the British remained in the interior of Georgia was brushed aside pretty easily. The royal governor returned, and he reestablished royal government. And so Georgia was once again a colony in the empire. Part one of the plan had gone exactly as it had been planned. And anybody who's been in the military knows that that is rare indeed for a plan to go exactly as it's supposed to. The Continental Congress all of a sudden realized it had a serious threat down south. They hadn't taken the threat very seriously. And so they appoint a new commander of Continental Forces, General Benjamin Lincoln, and send him down as the commander to the south. And our new allies, as a result of Saratoga, the French, arrive off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina in September 1779, and they have a planned attack to retake Savannah. The French think it's a good idea to retake Savannah, Georgia. And there is a planned attack on Savannah, which turns out not as the Americans and the French had planned it. Heavy American casualties in what was basically a frontal assault against the defended position. And with the losses, the French decided it was hurricane season and they sailed back to the West Indies. So part one of the plan is still in place. The American and French couldn't dislodge the British from Georgia. Part two was Charleston, South Carolina. Clinton and Cornwallis sailed from New York with an army, and the figures vary depending upon whose source you read, anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 men. It's a huge force in the 18th century. They maneuvered, all the fleet met up off the coast of Georgia and then decided where they would land in South Carolina. So it's not a secret that the British are coming. It's not a secret. But they land in South Carolina without any opposition whatsoever. The fleet, after dropping the troops off on the coast, moved to blockade Charleston Harbor, which effectively keeps any American ships out, but also keeps any Americans from leaving. And it also brings the heavy batteries of the guns potentially to play on the fort and the city of Charleston. General Benjamin Lincoln chose to defend the city of Charleston, partially at the urging of South Carolinians, but he had already kind of chosen to do that instead of using the terrain as natural defenses, the swamps and rivers of South Carolina. If you read Cornwallis's men and they're going through there, I mean, it takes them literally several months to get to the Ashley River because of the terrain. But in Charleston, and when you look at the maps of the campaign, you will see that Charleston's on a peninsula. Ashley River on one side, Cooper River on the other, and the British came in and blocked the American forces on the peninsula and began a very traditional siege warfare, which means they cut trenches and they get their guns closer so that they can finally begin to shell the city. In addition to the fact that they're moving closer, by now there have been reinforcements, and by the end of March, Cornwallis has got over 13,000 troops outside of Charleston Harbor. On May the 12th, General Benjamin Lincoln's trapped army surrenders, May the 12th, 1780. More than 5,500 men in uniform, Continentals, and militia were captured. American forts in the remainder of the state surrendered as well. It was a disaster for the American cause. For years now, people have been bragging about Saratoga, Saratoga, Saratoga. Charleston wiped out the memory of Saratoga.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Now, throughout the British Empire, when the news of the fall of Charleston, which by the way was the richest city in British North America, there were celebrations. Depending on where they were in the empire, they had grand illuminations, which everybody puts candles, and they had fireworks. There actually were fireworks and cannon in London. And in one imperial newspaper was the following comment: "The conquest and complete reduction of that opulent, populous, and very important colony of South Carolina." It was a big deal. Part two of the plan now seems to have been accomplished. They've got Charleston, the interior forts, and there were serious interior fortifications in South Carolina, also surrendered. To many Carolinians, the American cause seemed lost. A number of South Carolinians took protection of the crown, swore oaths of allegiance. And those who did not feel that way kept their mouths shut. In a letter to Lord Germain, who was Secretary of the Colonies, Clinton wrote, "There are not few men in South Carolina who are not our prisoners or in arms for us." Clinton, Cornwallis, they thought South Carolina Plan Part 2 was complete. But within 6 weeks, all of that changed dramatically as the British occupation of South Carolina began to unravel. And I think it's a good point now to talk about some terms that are going to be important for the rest of this Southern campaign, and that is loyalists and patriots. Who do you mean? Why do we have loyalists, and who are the loyalists? Loyalists were those who chose to fight for the king. In older histories, you will see them referred to as Tories, and frankly, contemporaries, Americans who were fighting them in the Revolution, referred to them as Tories. Because in England, the political parties, you were Tories, you were the king's friends, or you were a Whig and you were opposed to the king's party. Today, most textbooks use the term loyalist, but they decided to fight for the king. Now, why? That is not an easy topic. It's not just complicated. You know, when you talk to somebody today, they'll say, well, that's complicated. In the case of the South, it's not just complicated, it's very complicated. For a long time, historians used to say you could divide the population in the colonies into thirds. 1/3 were active revolutionaries, 1/3 were active loyalists, 1/3 in the middle, depending upon whose army was in the front yard. More recent historians, particularly in the South, have said they would like to paint the picture as 25% staunch patriots, 25% staunch loyalists, 50% undecided. And it would swing back and forth. But it's going to vary from state to state. What might apply in Georgia is not necessarily going to apply in Virginia. So that's why I say it's a complicated story. One thing we do know is that during and after the Revolution, more than 100,000 colonists who called themselves Americans and were loyalists left what is now the United States. They settled first in British East Florida, the Bahamas, or Canada. There are large groups of Americans in Nova Scotia. Even their descendants are there today. In South Carolina, they were a real cross-section of the population. Among those who were loyalists, and we know who the loyalists were because the British government after the war took statements from people and they were going to reimburse them for their losses in the war. There was a newspaper editor, a tailor, a planter, a midwife, a Baptist clergyman, free people of color. Some were from the interior, some were from the coast. So you can't just say folks from the backcountry had big loyalist sympathies or folks from the low country had big patriot sympathies. And again, you can do this in all states. It was a cross section. Many were motivated by belief. They believed in being loyal to king and country. Some had been motivated by treatment. And one of the classic examples that is used in the Revolution in the South is the South Carolinian who went by the nickname of Burnfoot Brown, who had been actually a patriot until his brother who was a loyalist, had been mistreated. And so then he turned into being a loyalist. He was captured by patriot forces and was tortured by having his feet burned. Literally, his feet were burned with tar. And he got the nickname Burnfoot Brown. He became a very successful fighter for the king. Now, southern colonies had another complication, an enslaved population. In South Carolina, more than half the population were people of color who were slaves. Some ran away when the British came, others were stolen by the British. Some fought for the patriot cause. Francis Marion had free men of color fighting for him in his forces. At Kings Mountain, at Cowpens, we have free men of color from South Carolina in arms fighting for the American cause. A sizable number in South Carolina did fight for the British. There was a Black Carolina Corps, which was a cavalry troop organized by the British, and when the war was over, they shipped out as a regular British Army unit to the West Indies. In Virginia, the royal governor offered freedom to any slave who signed to fight up for the king. Now, another complication was the presence of large numbers of Native Americans on the frontier. And they were a threat throughout the war, especially on the southern frontier. Notably the Cherokee, who controlled the frontier from Georgia all the way to Virginia. However, the largest single tribe in South Carolina were the Catawba, and the Catawba people fought with the Americans throughout the war. If you look at, again, Francis Marion, Andrew Pickens, Thomas Sumter, if you look at their rosters, you're going to find Catawba Indian braves on their rosters fighting for the Americans. So see, it's a complicated story. You can't make a generalization. And the same can be said with who was a patriot or who was a Whig. Why did people fight? So let's take a minute to look at that. Why did somebody become a patriot? Or why did he become a Whig, again using that, or as the English call them, a rebel? People could fight for ideals, and there was no question but what there were thousands of men in the South who were fighting for ideals. You can go back to Patrick Henry's famous quotation, "Give me liberty or give me death." But I'd like to quote from James Williams, who was a backcountry farmer in South Carolina from the frontier. And he wrote in 1779, this is before the British are back in South Carolina, so he has decided to join up as an older man, and he's writing to his son. He said, "I'm obliged to take the field in defense of my rights and liberties and that of my children, out of necessity and from the consideration that I had rather suffer anything than lose my birthright and that of my children." So he's fighting for liberty and freedom. Some were fighting because of the harsh treatment by the British Army of Occupation. And as I mentioned earlier, within 6 weeks after Lord Cornwallis and Sir Henry Clinton had declared victory in South Carolina, the occupation began to unravel. Regular British forces and Hessian mercenaries treated all civilians in the colonies as, and particularly in the South, as hostiles. There was no attempt to win the hearts and minds of South Carolinians, and they even drove men who were disposed to help them into joining the rebellion. In the backcountry of the two Carolinas, many individuals who were churched were members of the Presbyterian Church. Rural Presbyterian churches were routinely burned in South Carolina because they were declared to be sedition shops. In other words, their clergy opposed the royal occupation. Not only that, it was fairly common, and this started in South Carolina, continued into North Carolina. Property was wantonly destroyed. Crops, barns, homes, farm animals destroyed. Women, children, and the elderly roughed up. And when you think about fighting men, you don't often think about 13 and 14-year-olds as being fighting men. But our 7th president, Andrew Jackson, was 13. He was a member of what was called a partisan band, and we'll talk about a partisan is are independent fighters, guerrilla fighters, insurgents, terms used today. They call themselves partisans. He was with William Davie, a famous partisan from North Carolina that operated along the boundary of the two states. At age 13 and 14, he and his brother were a member of that band. They were captured. And an English officer ordered Andrew Jackson to shine his boots. And this scrawny little guy, and he was a scrawny little teenager, stood at attention and told this English officer, "Sir, I am a prisoner of war and demand that you treat me as such." Well, that was insolence of the first order. Who is this colonial? So the officer pulled his cavalry saber, which is a very heavy weapon, out of its sheath and took a swipe at Andrew Jackson. Andy was not only little and scrawny, but he was quick. He threw up his arm, blocked the blow. It didn't hit him in the head. It did go to the bone. It cut him to the bone. A scar he carried with him for the rest of his life, and when he became president, didn't help Anglo-American relations at all. Now, his older brother, Robert, 14, 1 year older, same demand was made. He made the same assertion, but he wasn't as quick. He was clipped in the head and died several weeks later of an infection, a very agonizing death, because he wouldn't shine the boots of an English officer. And stories like this could be told all over the Carolinas, and they were magnified. And there had been no restoration of royal government in South Carolina. Cornwallis and Clinton didn't see any need to do what they'd done in Georgia. They said they owned the province now, but they weren't secure enough to bring back royal officials. And so you've got people in South Carolina not just fighting like James Williams for the ideals of liberty. You've also got those who are fighting for vengeance. And in the backcountry Presbyterian churches, the interior churches in South Carolina along the frontier, there was a prayer that was used well into the 19th century in Presbyterian congregations, ranging from Camden all the way up to Salisbury in North Carolina, which first of all thanks God for the victories at Kings Mountains, Cowpens, and several others, and then concludes, "If you had not suffered the cruel Tories to burn Billy Hill's ironworks, we would not have asked any more favors at thy hands. Amen." So they were fighting because the enemy was there and had done something to one of their neighbors. The idea of British cruelty is not something that was just made up by American propaganda. Some Continental forces under Colonel Abraham Buford of Virginia, the Virginia line of Continentals, was marching south to reinforce the Americans at Charleston when he learned that Lincoln had surrendered. And so he turned back. His force was overtaken by one of Lord Cornwallis's cavalry officers, very effective soldier in the field if you're on that side, the British Legion. And at the Waxhaws on the border between the two Carolinas, almost 200 Americans were massacred when they tried to surrender.
Extra, extra, read all about it!
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it!
What became known as a result of Tarleton's brutality was a phrase used throughout the two Carolinas in particular to oppose the British. Tarleton's quarter, no mercy. In the days of the Revolution, if you were surrendering and you asked for quarter, it's like if you're having a neighborhood brawl and you say uncle or I give, you're surrendering. Buford's forces had asked for quarter and they were cut down, bayoneted. There's a very graphic description of this, again, and it comes from a church sermon from about 10 miles from the Waxhaws Presbyterian Church, which was being used as a hospital after the battle. And this other clergyman, urging all of the men in his congregation, by the way, to join up for the American cause, said, and the listener to this sermon said, he thundered, "Go see there," and he pointed towards where the Waxhaws Church was about 10 miles away. "Go see there the tender mercies of Great Britain. In that church you may find men, though still alive, hacked out of every semblance of humanity, some deprived of their arms, some with one arm a leg, and some with both legs cut off." This brutality pretty much moved into an Old Testament eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth conflict in the Carolinas. And if anything, the violence escalated. But it started with Tarleton, and throughout the Revolution you will hear in the South from now until the very end, in 1782, you're going to hear people talk about, if they ask for quarter, we'll give you Tarleton. Americans will respond, we'll give you Tarleton's quarter, which means you're a goner. So what had been potentially a docile province with people surrendering now was a hornet's nest. Although the Waxhaws was a terrible loss, terrible military tragedy, it became a byword for American cruelty, which was reinforced by Lord Cornwallis's order to his subordinate commanders in South Carolina to take the most vigorous measures to extinguish the rebellion in the district that you command. Now, he had a few problems, but then he had two great victories in the summer of 1780. After the fall of Charleston, Continental Congress sent a new commander to the South, General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, with a new army. And Gates was determined to win a victory to erase the memory of the surrender of Charleston. Now, he pushed his men relentlessly all night, and the Americans were tired and hungry. Many had intestinal problems by the time the American forces and the British forces kind of collided accidentally outside the little town of Camden, South Carolina. It was pure chance, because Cornwallis knew Gates was coming and he was pushing to find Gates. With an army composed primarily of militia and most of them ill, the wise thing for Gates to have done would have been to pull back and go on the defensive. But he wanted that victory, and so he ordered his men to attack. Once the fighting started, the militia broke and ran. The Continentals, the regular army, fought valiantly under the leadership of Baron Johann de Kalb, who fell fatally wounded with 11 sword, bayonet, and bullet wounds. Then even the Continentals retreated, but no one outran Horatio Gates, who didn't stop until they got to Hillsborough. The road to Charlotte, North Carolina from Camden, and that was a main highway in those days, was littered with broken wagons, abandoned equipment, dead horses, and dead and dying American soldiers. If you remember the pictures of what happened at the beginning of Operation Desert Storm on the Baghdad Highway, of the abandoned tanks, trucks, bodies, put that in an 18th century context, and that's exactly what you had, an utter rout of the American forces. There was now only a remnant of what had once been a Southern army left in the Carolinas to oppose the enemy, and they were at Hillsborough. But at the same time that the Continentals, the regular forces, had quite naturally had to move back to Hillsborough to save what was left of the army, you see the rise of partisan or guerrilla warfare in South Carolina. Partisans, guerrillas, insurgents, they all mean the same thing. They are local men who band together to fight the enemy in non-traditional ways. The reason that they rose up, as I mentioned earlier in that Presbyterian preacher's elder's prayer, was because of what they had done to one of their neighbors. Some of the first partisan bands actually appeared in the area around Billy Hill's Ironworks in what's now York County, South Carolina. But that didn't seem to bother Cornwallis, and particularly Bannister Tarleton, who became known for his pursuit of the enemy. He said, "Nothing will serve these people but the fire and the sword." And he also recommended to Lord Cornwallis that what he should do to South Carolina is what Rome did to Carthage: destroy everything and salt the field so that nothing will ever grow here again. So is it any wonder that particularly these frontiersmen from South Carolina got upset about the British Army of Occupation? Modern stories of guerrilla warfare, which is what people are fighting today in the 21st century around the world, one of the observations is brutality, fear, and the resulting social disorganization can only work for the guerrillas no matter who initiates it. It's a perfect description of South Carolina in 1780 and 81. And actually we can bleed that on over into North Carolina up through Charlotte and up towards Salisbury as well. There were a number of partisans, in fact dozens, but among the better known were in South Carolina, Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, Andrew Pickens. In North Carolina, William Davie and William Lee Davidson. Now, for nearly a century after the Revolution, Francis Marion was a national hero. He wasn't just a Southern or a South Carolina hero. There are towns and counties in 17 states across the country, from South Carolina to Oregon, and in between in Ohio and Indiana, named for Francis Marion. Parson Weems, who wrote the wonderful biography of George Washington, all the wonderful children's stories people remember about George Washington, written by Parson Weems. He also wrote a biography of Francis Marion. Poets in New England wrote the Song of Marion's Men, William Cullen Bryant, one of the first great New England poets. Now, over here, have a display of books from the library here at the Society of the Cincinnati. And Francis Marion inspired fiction throughout the 19th century. The Boy is Spies with Francis Marion. The Swamp Fox, A Young Folk's Life of General Francis Marion. There are dozens of those which show you that the memory of the Revolution and the Revolution in the South was still with Americans even after the Civil War. Now, partisans or guerrillas, and I'm going to use the term partisan, that's my personal preference. What kind of tactics? I said they used different tactics. They didn't do the usual European formal thing of the armies getting across a football field and lining up and shooting at one another. They fought like Native Americans. They hid behind rocks. They hit and run. They sort of had the childhood thing of he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. Mao Zedong, the great Chinese leader who successfully conquered China through guerrilla warfare, said this is what a guerrilla or a partisan should do. Select the tactic of seeming to come from the east, but attack from the west. Avoid the solid attack, attack the hollow. Withdraw, deliver a lightning blow. Withdraw. It worked. In fact, I've had more than one military historian say it looks like he might have been sitting on the back of Francis Marion's horse when he came up with those tactics. And what it did, all of a sudden, all over the state of South Carolina, you've got these small bands not coordinating, but they're hitting these isolated British outposts, and they're tying down British forces all over the state. And one of the frustrating things to the British is they never knew who their friends were. They never knew really who was the enemy. And so this led to an escalation of brutality in the backcountry, the frontier of the Carolinas on both sides. The chaos on the frontier of the Carolinas was in many ways responsive to what Cornwallis promulgated. He said if someone were not openly for the king, then every measure should be taken to see that they didn't cause any problems. So if you're not for us openly, then you're obviously against us. And he began to use the term civil war to describe the conflict in the Carolinas. Now, between the fall of Charleston and Camden and Kings Mountain, there were 9 battles along the border of the two Carolinas. All of these battles, which Cornwallis and Tarleton dismissed as commotions, were victories for partisans. After the Battle of Camden, Cornwallis and most of his army headed to Charlotte, North Carolina. He was going to set up his headquarters there, invade the rest of the state, and then move on into Virginia. Because despite the commotions, he was sure that part 2 of the grand plan was working. As he said, it's imagined in hope that these internal troubles would survive and the inhabitants would gain information of the late distinguished superiority because of His Majesty's arms. He said they ought to know what's better. But at the same time he's moving into Charlotte, people like Tarleton and his district commanders have gotten everybody so irritated that these commotions are taking place from the mountains to the sea. He can't be blamed for being so bold because not only had he defeated the Continental Army at Camden, 2 days after that, one of the largest partisan bands under Thomas Sumter was surprised at Fishing Creek, decimated, and he is just convinced, Cornwallis is convinced, that North Carolina was the key to holding South Carolina because what reinforcements were slipping into South Carolina were being, Sumter, for example, had organized his band in North Carolina across the border. Others had used the Catawba Reservation. So they were coming across the line, and it's just, if we take care of that, North Carolina, then we've got South Carolina for it. And of course, if we move into North Carolina, then all those good loyalists that King George thinks is there will come out and support us. Now, as Cornwallis marched on Charlotte, Major James Ferguson and about 1,000 loyalist militia were headed for western North Carolina. And behind them, both of them left a very unpacified South Carolina. Because within 2 weeks after his being defeated, Thomas Sumter had raised a partisan force of nearly another 1,000 men, which Cornwallis, writing to his superiors, said, that indefatigable Sumter is in the field again. Well, yes, he was able to raise, and it wasn't just him. He wasn't even mentioning Marion. Cornwallis wouldn't even mention Marion in the swamps of northeastern South Carolina, or Andrew Pickens along the Georgia border. Now, the sections of North Carolina where the British were headed were just as inhospitable as South Carolina. As soon as Cornwallis occupied Charlotte, William Davie and his partisans in North Carolina made life miserable for British patrols and supply convoys. In fact, they talked about Charlotte being the hornet's nest, that they had kicked over a hornet's nest when they moved into that part of North Carolina. Meanwhile, Major Ferguson is marching into the western frontier settlements, and he sent a message to the inhabitants. And the western settlements are now the very western part of North Carolina over into eastern Tennessee, which at that point was still part of North Carolina. The settlements over the mountain were called the over the mountain settlements. And he told them, do not resist British arms. If you resist, I'm going to march my army over the mountains, hang your leaders, and lay waste your country with fire and sword. Now, the response to this threat was, within days, more than 1,000 of these over-the-mountain men gathered on the banks of the Watauga River, crossed over the mountain, and headed for Ferguson. He had thrown down a challenge, and they were going to respond. And he issued another proclamation, which was even more insulting, then decided maybe he'd best head towards Charlotte to link up with Lord Cornwallis. And during the first week of October, 1780, the over-the-mountain men, once they got on east of the mountains, they were joined by partisans from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And these various local leaders chose a Virginian, William Campbell, who had been an officer in the Continental Line at one point, now living over the mountains, to be their overall commander. Within 24 hours, they had confirmed that Ferguson was heading towards Kings Mountain. And it was clear that from their spies that they had in his camp, and there were American spies in Ferguson's camp, that told them exactly he was going to make some kind of a defensive position there. He wasn't just going to camp overnight. He wasn't going to move directly to Charlotte to link up with Cornwallis. We never know why he did not do that. Now, the site he chose, Kings Mountain, is technically not a mountain. Geographers and geologists will get into that. It's a series of ridges, very high points in the plain there, the Piedmont. It rises about 60 feet from the surrounding countryside, and its sides are very steep. At the top, the flat area is about the size of a football field, roughly the size of a modern football field. But the steep slopes were covered with trees in 1780, which provided cover, certainly for those on the attack. The overconfident Ferguson didn't even construct any defensive positions on the top of the mountain. It also began to rain heavily on October the 7th, and it rained until midday on October the 8th, when the Patriots had totally encircled the mountain. And on the command of Campbell, they all charged up the hill. The defenders on the mountain used a common British tactic, bayonet charge. There were 3 bayonet charges by the Loyalist militia under Ferguson. All 3 failed. The defenders also, the weapons made a difference in this particular battle. They were using muskets. And muskets are difficult to aim, and they were also shooting downhill, so they were shooting high. They were shooting over the heads of the attackers. But those frontiersmen all had rifles, which are weapons that when they aim, they get what they are aiming, the person they're trying to get. And as more than one of those frontiermen said, it was like a turkey shoot going after Ferguson and his men. Ferguson tried to rally everybody. He mounted literally a white horse, and he was riddled with bullets. Then the militia, the Loyalist militia, tried to surrender. They asked for quarter, and from all over the sides of the mountains came, "Give them Tarleton's quarter." It took a while for Colonel Campbell and the other commanders to get their men under control, because they were avenging the deaths of friends and neighbors who had been attacked by the British over time. Now, the bitterness felt by patriots towards the Tories, there's a documented example that under the field of battle lay a wounded Tory, and he saw his brother-in-law, a captain in one of the partisan groups, and he pleaded to him for assistance. And his brother-in-law just looked down at him and said, "Look to your friends for help," and walked on by. In less than an hour at Kings Mountain, The partisans had destroyed a superior force of more than 1,000. Besides Ferguson, there were about 160 dead, about the same number wounded, 700 prisoners of war. Now, the significance of Kings Mountain. Sir Henry Clinton, the overall commander of British forces in America, said in his memoirs that Kings Mountain was unhappily the first link in a chain of evils that followed in regular succession until at last ended in the loss of America. George Washington said that it was proof of the spirit and resources of the country. After Kings Mountain, you weren't going to have many loyalists run out to join the Cornwallis and his friends. They went into deep hiding. It also encouraged supporters of the revolution. And those on the fence began to jump to the Patriot side. Most important of all, it caused Cornwallis to change his plans. Instead of marching on into North Carolina and Virginia, he moved back into South Carolina for the winter, delayed his invasion of North Carolina for a full year.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
Now, enter Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene is the new commander of American forces, the Continental Army in the South. One of George Washington's great friends. In fact, he was the person Washington wanted to send down first, but Congress sent Horatio Gates. And along with him came an incredible Virginia soldier, Daniel Morgan. In North Carolina, they managed to patch together an army of Continentals and militia. And then Nathaniel Greene did something very daring that most military commanders don't do. He divided his army, which was already outnumbered by the British. He divided them. He took the main section of the army with him to Cheraw in South Carolina, right along the border, where he could get food and fodder for his forces, because the area around Charlotte, North Carolina had been depleted by the British. He sent the rest of his army under Daniel Morgan west across South Carolina to threaten British outposts at 96 and perhaps even going all the way to Georgia. So Cornwallis's response was, instead of taking on one American force at a time when he had the superior forces, he divided his army. He stayed there looking after, he didn't want General Greene to all of a sudden decide to leave Cheraw and take Camden, South Carolina, which was the main British outpost in the back country. He sent Bannister Tarleton, his right-hand man, to go chasing after Daniel Morgan. When Morgan realized he was being pursued, he decided to make a stand. And he decided to make a stand at a place called Hannah's Cow Pens. Now, there's a reason it's called a cow pen, because in the back country of the Carolinas, people raised cattle on the open range. We had cowboys in the Carolinas for a long time before they got to Texas, okay? And what you would do is individuals would get together at a cow pen, they'd be herded together, and because, one farmer might have 10, one might have 5, they'd get together and then they would have a cattle drive to the market in Charleston, okay? So it was also chosen by Daniel Morgan because everybody knew where Hannah's Cow Pens was. So all of a sudden, with what has happened elsewhere, you've got hundreds of militia, patriot militia, signing up, moving in with Daniel Morgan. his battle plan, and I must say it's still studied today at the United States Military Academy at West Point because of its significance. He knew his men, he knew the terrain, and he knew his enemy. Everything a commander needs to do to be successful. And what I mean about that is he had a mixed army, Daniel Morgan did, of Continentals who could stand up to a British bayonet charge. He had militia who might be good for a couple of rounds, and then they're going to want to get out of the way of a British charge. And so he took that into consideration. That was part of his plan, was to have the militia on the front line to fire 2 volleys and then maneuver around. Then there'd be regulars, and then there was cavalry in reserve. And as things worked out, as soon as Tarleton, who was impetuous, and Morgan knew that, as soon as he saw that first rank of Americans, the militia, break ranks and move, he thought now's the time to move in for the kill. Well, as soon as he moved in, Colonel William Washington and his cavalry sweep around the side, and the American infantry turns around and fires 2 more volleys point blank into the advancing British. This is the only pitched battle in the American Revolution where British forces turned and ran from the American army, the Battle of Cowpens. In an hour, Banastre Tarleton had lost 1,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. It's an incredible blow to Cornwallis's army. He personally escaped narrowly after a head-to-head clash with Colonel William Washington of the Continental Cavalry. And he also, as Tarleton retreated, and he did escape, his men didn't, he did, he ordered huge stocks of British military materiel, arms, food, destroyed so as not to fall into the hands of the Americans. Now, the significance of Cowpens, first of all, is a tremendous morale booster for everybody. But more importantly, Cornwallis's army is now weakened just as he's planning a new invasion of North Carolina and Virginia. Morgan smartly doesn't stay around to go chasing Tarleton. He immediately begins to move back towards North Carolina. Greene moves back to North Carolina. They meet up at Guilford Courthouse, but they don't fight a battle there this time. They meet up, and their plan is to move across North Carolina as rapidly as they can to get to the other side of the Dan River, and there get new recruits and maybe go on the counteroffensive. And that is exactly what they did. Cornwallis was never able to get local intelligence to find out what the enemy was doing. After Cowpens, nobody was going to tell the Brits anything. And the race to the Dan, like Valley Forge, it is one of those remarkable examples of American soldiers' courage. We know how pitifully clothed that the men at Valley Forge were. But this is the way Greene, in a letter to Washington, described the condition of his men as they were marching sometimes 20, 30 miles a day through snow and ice. This is in the winter of 1781. The most miserable situation of the troops has rendered the march the most painful imaginable. Several hundred of the soldiers marking the ground with their bloody feet. They didn't have shoes. But our army is in good spirits, notwithstanding their sufferings and excessive fatigue. They crossed the Dan River a day ahead of Cornwallis, got reinforcements. Cornwallis turned around and went marching back into North Carolina toward Guilford Courthouse. Greene followed, but now Cornwallis and his army were the hunted instead of the hunter. Greene chose the battle next, the battle site at Guilford Courthouse. His plan was similar of that to Morgan's at Cowpens, but unfortunately didn't work out quite as well as Cowpens. Statistically, it might be called a draw. Technical military historians say it was a British victory because they maintained the field when the day was over. But at a certain point, Greene sensibly withdrew his men from the field because his purpose was to save his army, not to occupy the territory. But the battle lasted an hour and a half, but it was a costly victory for Cornwallis. He lost 1/4 of his army, killed, wounded, prisoners. In London, a member of Parliament described it as a Pyrrhic victory after the classical victory, or another such victory and we are undone. In the space of 2 months between Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis's effectives had been reduced by more than 50%. After Guilford Courthouse, he only has 1,400 effectives. It's a beaten army. And in his biographer's words, Guilford Courthouse was a victory, but so dearly bought that Cornwallis would never resume the offensive again in the Carolinas. And he began to retreat to Wilmington, North Carolina on the coast, where he hoped he could be resupplied. But that retreat took 3 weeks. And Cornwallis wrote to a colleague, "I assure you that I am quite tired of marching about the countryside in search of adventures." However, he had a plan for victory. He said, "Let's take on Virginia." He was writing, "We'll get those troops from New York and I'll march into Virginia, and then the revolution will be won." He didn't leave North Carolina immediately. He wanted to make sure that South Carolina was secure. And the British did defeat Nathaniel Greene at the Battle of Hobkirk Hill, which is near Camden. But again, this was one of those close things. It was a draw. At a certain point, Greene decides, I'm going to keep my army and I'm going to move back. The British won Hobkirk Hill, but they had to abandon Camden. So, I mean, and this begins to happen all over South Carolina. So thinking South Carolina safe, he begins the march to Virginia. And then, as his biographers note, on the 13th of May, 1781, Cornwallis crossed his Rubicon, the Roanoke River. Virginia in 1781 is interesting prior to the Battle of Yorktown. American forces are under the command of a young Frenchman, nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette. He has a small army keeping an eye on British forces commanded by American traitor Benedict Arnold. And once Cornwallis gets there, joins up with Arnold, they sort of have a cat and mouse game between Lafayette and Cornwallis across the state. Now, one of the reasons that Lafayette was able to be so successful, he was a very able young man, but he had a spy in Cornwallis's camp. He had a servant, a person of color, who was placed in Cornwallis's personal retinue, and he had the name James Lafayette. That might have given somebody a clue. But literally, James Lafayette was feeding information on almost a daily basis to Lafayette. In New York, Sir Henry Clinton directed Cornwallis to establish a defended post at an anchorage where British warships could come in terms of support. And he said, choose either Old Point Comfort or Yorktown on the James. Old Point Comfort was on the James. Cornwallis's military engineers decided that Old Point Comfort wasn't good and Yorktown was the answer, and that's where Cornwallis established his camp, where eventually his biographers couldn't say he met his Waterloo, but that is exactly what happened. And so I now have Cornwallis to Yorktown. And
well, that is this week's TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour. I hope that you got some good mental edification from that lecture. I know it really puts the American Revolution into a totally new perspective to think that it wasn't just a bunch of battles happening up in New England, in New York, and Boston, but that just as much of this was happening in the southern states as was happening in the northern states. And so I'd like to call your attention to our website, www.barnesreview.org. When you're there, click on the radio button and look at the back radio broadcast here of TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour, and TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Show. Last week's Dixie Heritage Show went viral and on YouTube, and we've just gotten just thousands of hits on that. And I guess a lot of people were interested in Dave Gahari's conversation about the time that he met Hillary Clinton. And so anyways, go to www.barnesreview.org. Until then, from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents, God bless. Be back again next week.